Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. The Salish Sea Institute and Western Washington University Alumni Office are excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Reconstructing Ancestral Tsleil-Waututh Diets, Archaeology and Ecology for Indigenous Food Sovereignty. First, I want to acknowledge that Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. My name is Dr. Cindy Elliser. I'm the Associate Director of the Salish Sea Institute and will be your host for the event. At the Salish Sea Institute, we collaborate with regional universities, government agencies, Indigenous communities, and nonprofit organizations to conduct scientific research, develop sustainable management strategies, and educate the public about the environment, social, and economic importance of the Salish Sea. And we are so glad you joined us today to learn more about the Salish Sea today. So I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Megan Efford, who is a zoo archaeologist and historical ecologist who recently defended her PhD at the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. She specializes in human to environment relationships over deep time, ecosystem modeling, and community-driven archaeology. So I'm very excited to hear what she has to tell us today. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Some of you submitted questions with your registration, and we appreciate those. We have tried to incorporate those questions into the discussion topics today as much as we could, or as much as Megan could. However, as we move through our discussion, please use the Q&A feature, which will be at the bottom middle of your screen to send any questions as you get them, and we'll monitor those, and hopefully in the last 10 minutes or so, we'll be able to ask some of those questions at the end if we have some time. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Efford, and excited to hear about what you have to tell us about.
There we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for hearing some of the work that I've been focusing on the past 5 years as part of my PhD. This was a collaborative research project between Tsleil-Waututh Nation, which is one of the Coast Salish nations here in what is now known as Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and UBC through the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries and the Department of Anthropology, and also through Carewood Lidle, which is an environmental engineering firm who helped us as a partner to get a MyTax Accelerate internship to fund the project. And for those of you who aren't aware, a MyTax Accelerate is a Canadian settler government-funded internship for graduate studies. So that was very helpful getting this work funded. And because I just finished this work, I'd really like to start with gratitude and mention that really many people made this work possible over the past 5 years. We had some main co-authors, including my supervisory committee, but also Michael and Michelle George, who are the Tsleil-Waututh knowledge holders who are co-authors on the project. And then we also have Tsleil-Waututh knowledge holders and experts, Gabriel George and Carlene Thomas, who provided so much information and their time, and we were really generous with their knowledge for this research. And also thank you to the Salish Sea Institute and the Foundation for WWU and Alumni for the invitation to share this work, which is so special to me. Now that it's all done and wrapped up and published, it feels really good to be able to share it with everyone. So I just want to start with situating us within the perspective of historical ecology. As a historical ecologist, I focus on human communities and how they influence and have influenced their local environments over time, how the local environments influence human communities and their cultures. And we're looking at this over deep timescales, which in archaeology is 100 and 1,000-year timescales. But if we bring in geological and paleontological data, we can go back even farther. And as a settler archaeologist, someone with European ancestry who's only a second-generation Canadian, the work that I do is really in service of the human communities who have been here for time immemorial. And I'm trying to make sure that the work that I do is in service of Indigenous communities and not contributing to the harm that archaeology as a discipline has traditionally been contributing to over its tenure. When we're talking about Coast Salish subsistence, we know that Coast Salish nations and communities have been cultivating and relying on their homelands and waters for millennia. The Salish Sea is a highly productive ecosystem. It's basically one giant estuary, and it also has an upwelling system that brings nutrient-rich cold water up, fueling coastal productivity. So it makes sense that the marine and intertidal ecosystems would be providing an abundance of food. But forest and mountainous ecosystems also provided a wide range of animal and plant foods as well. And the Coast Salish communities throughout the region have created and managed forest and intertidal gardens, used intentional management techniques to steward fish and mammal populations, and all of this is highly tailored to their traditional territories. So you can see why this historical ecology perspective would be really helpful. And for today, I'm going to focus on a specific nation, Tsleil-Waututh Nation, as a case study within Coast Salish subsistence, because that's the nation for whom I did this work as part of my PhD. So just to introduce this context of reconstructing ancestral Tsleil-Waututh diets, this project was requested by Tsleil-Waututh Nation and falls under their Cumulative Effects Monitoring Initiative. This is one of the nation's many stewardship and ecosystem monitoring projects. The nation has a lot of people power and a lot of scientific research and archaeological work under their roof. It's a really powerful team. They do a lot of really exciting work. So I encourage you to look up their website and look at their blogs and their newsletters, because their work that they're doing is really very cool. And through this project, which is a section within the PhD that was requested, our goal was to build an estimated pre-contact diet that ancestral Tsleil-Waututh people would have obtained from Tsleil-Waututh specifically. And I'll explain what that study area means in a moment. But I do want to note that we didn't include trade or import or export of foods, because Tsleil-Waututh Nation really wanted to focus on what their traditional territory could have offered their communities. But import and export of foods, trade is an incredibly important part of Coast Salish subsistence. It's just not within the scope of this research. So Tsleil-Waututh is also now known as Burrard Inlet. It's at the center of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Tsleil-Waututh. And Tsleil-Waututh translates to people of the inlet in the downriver Hulkaminam dialect, which is just kind of tells you how important Tsleil-Waututh, that ecosystem, the inlet ecosystem, is to the First Nation. And as part of the First Nation origin, we know that Tsleil-Waututh people came out of Tsleil-Waututh. The first Tsleil-Waututh people came out of this ecosystem. It also wraps around and through Metro Vancouver. It's been the home to Tsleil-Waututh since time immemorial, but it's also now home to many urban, industrial, and commercial interests. This research is led by Tsleil-Waututh and incorporates Tsleil-Waututh science and traditional ecological knowledge at its heart. And this is because this ecosystem is this nation's homeland. So what we wanted to do kind of in a big picture is to better understand the cumulative effects and ecological impacts of settler colonization in Tsleil-Waututh. And food is a really important part of how people interact with their homes. So settler colonization had a big impact on food. And by establishing what the Tsleil-Waututh ecosystem looked like before colonization, we can contribute to understanding Tsleil-Waututh stewardship and relationships to the waters and lands of their territory, and figuring out what Tsleil-Waututh people were eating and how much they were taking out of the ecosystem was a really big part of that ecosystem reconstruction. And so I'm going to focus on the dietary work and then explain how we incorporated that into the ecosystem reconstruction work after that as well, just so you can get an idea of how this work can be leveraged in service of these communities. So to do this work, we drew on 4 main data sets. First was Tsleil-Waututh science and oral histories, archaeology, which is my comfort zone, that's where my toolbox comes in, historical and archival records, and then local ecology. And alone, each of these data sets has gaps and biases, but together they bridge those gaps and create a more whole picture. I use a spinning metaphor to describe this idea, because if there are any fiber artists in the audience, you'll know that when spinning wool alone, each fiber is weak. but once spun together, they create a stronger whole, something that can withstand tension. Hence the drop spindle in the image here, because spinning is a really important part of Coast Salish cultures and my own cultural and family heritage from England. And we commissioned this artwork from the wonderful artist Irene de Jong in England to represent the work artistically. You'll see pieces of her work as well as work from Tsleil-Waututh artist Candace Thomas throughout the presentation, and you should definitely look them up. I highly recommend working with artists to represent your science. It's a really wonderful collaborative opportunity. And because we're working with so many different disciplines and disciplinary data sets, and we're trying to focus on making sure this work is really useful to the people who are most impacted by it, we used a transdisciplinary approach, which has an emphasis on co-design, co-evaluation, and co-production of research, with the communities most impacted by the research involved in this way from the beginning. So while interdisciplinary scientists and researchers are often doing this already, the transdisciplinary approach really does it intentionally and from right from the beginning, establishing research questions, establishing parameters, and that level of integration is just intentionally higher. And so you might do interdisciplinary work that can be classified as transdisciplinary already, and it's a body of research and literature that I encourage you to look into, because it is a really cool perspective on how to have that really high level of integration across science and society. And the use of a transdisciplinary approach to ecosystem modeling, to understanding archaeology and what archaeology can actually tell us about the past, helps us address something called shifting baseline syndrome using this historical ecological framework. So when we're talking about something called shifting baseline syndrome, which was coined by Daniel Pauly in the 1990s, what we're thinking of is that within our lifetimes, our perspectives and understandings of what an acceptable ecological baseline or what the ecological condition is shifts over time because of a lack of incorporation on data and experience of past ecosystem states. And so as we go back in time and incorporate these past data sets, we get a better idea of what these ecosystems actually looked like. But within our lifetimes are quite short, and our understandings of what these ecosystems looked like are really limited within Western science and within kind of these shorter human life lifespans of understandings. And so incorporating archaeological data, incorporating oral histories, that pulls our understanding back and incorporates more changes. So we can better understand how these ecosystems have changed over time. And because historical ecology looks at how humans and environments are really so intertwined, this perspective and this approach can be really helpful. When we wrapped up this work, we met with Michael George, who's a Tsleil-Waututh knowledge holder and expert on traditional ecological knowledge, and the project coordinator who oversees the Cumulative Effects Monitoring Initiative, just to get Mike's perspectives on the project and kind of reflect on how it went and what we really wanted to get out of it. And he said on why this project is important to the community, that one of the things the community wants to do is to be able to eat off the beach again. Because currently the intertidal zone is poisoned by toxic waste. It's really hard to find food that's healthy to eat. And a lot of the fish populations have been really highly impacted by settler commercial fisheries. And so this isn't really something that the community is able to do in any meaningful way right now. So we need to understand what's causing all of these different problems. Why has the city been built in such a way that the toxic waste is pumped out into the ocean but comes right back into the inlet? Why is it so hard to find food that's safe to eat? And so this is kind of the impetus for this research, was really understanding how the community is able to feed itself through traditional foodways, which have been impacted by urbanization and settler colonization increasingly over the 250 years. And importantly, on why scientific research should be done with the community, he said, we're always lumped in with somebody. It's never Tsleil-Waututh standing alone. It's always Tsleil-Waututh as part of Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh as part of Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh as part of Musqueam. Our grandparents always identified as Tsleil-Waututh, you know, people of the inlet. Even before it was publicly out there, we're people of the inlet. That's somebody writing our history for us. We get mislabeled. And this is something that became really apparent very quickly in the historical and archival data, is that Tsleil-Waututh was really ignored or lumped in with other nations in the area. And Burrard Inlet or Tsleil-Waututh was ignored very highly, which was curious because it's a big ecosystem. So why isn't it being documented the same way the nearby Fraser River is being documented? And because we have all these different data sets, we need to incorporate multiple ways of knowing. And importantly, incorporating Tsleil-Waututh science is really essential to the transdisciplinary approach that we took. To do that, we held frequent collaborative review meetings to include Tsleil-Waututh collaborators as co-creators of the research from the get-go. And during these meetings, we created research questions, established methods, reviewed results, and planned dissemination. And Tsleil-Waututh held official reviews of all papers. So that's how we incorporated the Tsleil-Waututh science. For archaeology, we used data from 8 different archaeological sites. With this map, you can see kind of where they're spread out over this ecosystem. And highlighted is one specific site, number 6, Tumtumewatun, which is where some of the new archaeological data we collected comes from. So I'm going to give you a mini case study within this case study as well for understanding Tsleil-Waututh salmon fisheries. So we're going to focus on Tumtumewatun, and then we're going to bring it back to the big picture. So I did an archaeological inventory of data, primarily from Tumtumewatun, but also from Seymamet, which was another site on that map. But the data that we used from the other sites was already existing and already published. So that was very helpful. But we needed some new data to get a bit more high resolution, specifically to do with salmon. That was something that was really important to Tsleil-Waututh. So we assessed the continuity and sustainability of the Pacific salmon fishery at Tumtumewatun, which is an ancestral Tsleil-Waututh settlement, one of the really very big ones, very important ones, over thousands of years before European contact. And so in this area, European contact or first contact is established as 1792. That's actually first settlement. Contact happened earlier than that, but that's the date you'll see in the literature as first contact is 1792. And if you're interested in reading about the Pacific salmon fishery specifically, the QR code will send you to that paper. It's open access, but I'll give you a brief overview of it here. So to do this assessment of the salmon fishery, I collected samples from the cultural shell deposit, which are also called middens, at Tumtumewatun. We used 2 different excavation units, and I also collected 8 new radiocarbon dates. So we're getting a lot of information from this one site, including 245 fish vertebrae. 230 of them were identified as specific salmon species using an approach called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, or ZOOMS. This is collagen fingerprinting. So similar to DNA that gives you a fingerprint of a species or of a genus, collagen can do something very similar. It's also a little bit faster, a little cheaper than DNA. So because Dr. Camilla Speller, one of my committee members and co-authors, has a lab and a team at UBC Anthropology who can do this work and had funding to do work specifically with collagen fingerprinting, we were able to run hundreds of samples, which was very exciting. And it was also inspired by and building on work that was published by Morin and Yang over multiple sites. So we focused on one site and expanded the time period we looked at. And so I grouped the samples of the different vertebrae and the different dates to look at what different species were contributing to the diet over time, and trying to figure out if there was a specific salmon species that was contributing the most to the diet. And there was. It's chum salmon. So in this ecosystem, chum, pink, and coho salmon are the primary salmon runs. There's not very much sockeye or chinook at all. Those runs are farther south in the Fraser River, but these three were the ones that we were expecting to see. And chum salmon kind of dominated dominated the assemblage. It was 78% of the assemblage here. And that's in the green. It's the most commonly harvested species over the more than 2,000 years of the fishery. Pink salmon have runs every other year, so they're still contributing. They're just not as big a contributor. And we're interpreting this, the ubiquity and the abundance of Pacific salmon through time as evidence of a highly specialized and sustainable fishery, because we would expect to see kind of a drop-off of chum if chum was overexploited, or if there wasn't enough of it to feed the community. It would drop off. It wouldn't continue on through the years. So that's what we would expect to see if it wasn't sustainable. But we're seeing instead this really consistent contribution. To incorporate archaeological data, it offers a window into how humans are interacting with their environments in the past. And these cultural shell deposits, which are also called middens, are time capsules of information that tell us about what plants and animals human communities are relying on. But the material is subject to issues of preservation and collection bias. So plants and fragile animal remains are often underrepresented. So as an example, in this ecosystem, the groundwater is really acidic. So the soil is really acidic. So not everything preserves very well, but middens and cultural shell deposits, these accumulations of bones and shell become less acidic, more alkaline as the shell breaks down. So the reason why we call them time capsules is because they're a very specific type of micro ecosystem that becomes better at preserving things as it breaks down over time. This data gives us species lists, an idea of abundance. It gives us perspectives on the relative contributions of different foods to human diets. But we do have to keep in mind that different things are going to preserve differently. And a lot of the data I'm relying on is coming from excavations in the 70s and 80s. And that work was done before a few different kind of revolutions in archaeological approaches to excavation and data collection. And so there's definite bias in how that material was collected and then stored. So not everything was actually taken out of the field. A lot of things were washed away in the field. And so we have to be aware that we're not actually seeing the entire picture. It's never going to be a time machine. It's just a window into the past. There's definitely error there. When we're talking about incorporating historical data, like ships' journals and records, newspapers, settler government records, sales records, things like that, anything written during the settler period, starting around 1790s. This offers a written record that's often very biased. So for example, ships' journals were written by individuals without training in or knowledge of the local ecology. It's very helpful and it is interesting to read these ships' journals, but often somebody will be saying, oh, we were given this species by the local indigenous population when we did some trade with them. And that species is something that's actually found in England. We have to translate that into what the species would be here. But that part wasn't the most challenging. Settler government records, though, will focus on what the government is interested in and finds important. Tsleil-Waututh was largely ignored, like I said, as was Tsleil-Waututh. But this I find curious because the Port of Vancouver, which is the largest marine port in Canada, was eventually built in Tsleil-Waututh, which begs the question, why ignore the very large salmon runs, the very large herring and other forage fish populations, and other highly abundant foods that were the focus of the Fraser River records and Fraser River commercial fisheries? But yeah, why ignore this when obviously this area is very important to the government? So there are some definite bias issues in this data set as well. The local ecology gives us an idea of what species could be present, interspecies interactions, who's eating what, how much biomass could fit in the ecosystem, that kind of thing. So when we're reconstructing the size of the salmon run in the past, for example, only so many fish can fit in the ecosystem. And so the local ecology gives us an idea of these kind of parameters that can be very helpful. And just to know what was possibly the ecosystem to eat. And because this data was also used to reconstruct the pre-contact ecosystem baseline, this information on who's eating what and how was really essential to building the pre-contact diet. It also helps us fill in gaps and, like I said, translate settler journal records when they mention those European species. So that can be very helpful. To bring it all together, this was a highly iterative process. Many drafts were reviewed with our Tsleil-Waututh collaborators on a really regular basis to ensure that the data was aligned with the Tsleil-Waututh traditional ecological knowledge. And this approach caught those gaps. An example is a too low estimation of the contribution of crabs. Because of the acidic groundwater, because of how the excavations were done, crab shell just wasn't in the samples. And so I wasn't seeing a lot of crab. And so that's something that was really, really underrepresented in those initial drafts. But our Tsleil-Waututh knowledge holders said, no, crab is a really important part. Crab is incredibly important to our traditional diets. We have artwork that shows it. We have records from our grandparents that tell us this. And so I was able to increase the contribution of crabs based on that knowledge that the archaeology just was missing because of how the samples were excavated back in the 70s and 80s. But we also needed more information to make the estimated pre-contact diet nutritionally viable. So we need to know what humans need to eat and how many calories do adults need to eat, things like that. We needed another set of data that falls under nutritional health as well. So to do that, we're going to consider the historical needs of what's called a moderately active population, and I'll explain why in a second. But we also average it across children, adults, elders, and pregnant and lactating adults. And then the live weight versus edible weight of all included food groups, because a whole salmon is a different weight than the amount of that salmon that's actually edible. So based on those numbers, which are based on the U.S. Department of Agriculture and U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Dietary Guidelines for Americans, 2020 to 2025, which is the most recent one. We're using the moderately active numbers because we found that this best aligns with a fisher hunter-gatherer population, while active would better align with professional athletes. And this is based on some work done on Hadza diets. A 2012 study showed similar caloric consumption rates to the US guidelines for moderately active adults in Europe. So those numbers better aligned together. This is a very different culture, very different diet and local environment, but the Hadza are one of the few communities in the world who continue to live as hunter-gatherers. Their diet focuses on wild game, honey, and plant foods, primarily tubers and berries. This was published in PLOS One in 2012 if you're interested in learning more about their work. We also drew on traditional Inuit diets, again for context, which rely heavily on marine and tidal goods, and wide variety across mammals, fish, shellfish, and birds. And so Inuit communities are Indigenous communities across the Canadian and American Arctic. So this includes Alaskan communities, but also goes outside of North America as well. There are high levels of protein, fat, and omega-3 fatty acids, and very limited quantities of carbohydrates, which you can imagine in the Arctic, not a lot of carbohydrates to be found. But the high levels of fat make it possible to safely consume the really high levels of protein and avoid something called protein sickness or protein poisoning, or rabbit starvation, which is essentially succumbing to malnutrition by eating just protein. Our bodies can't really process that properly. So you need high levels of either fat or carbohydrates to be able to process that high protein. So both Traditional Inuit diets and traditional Hadza diets have high protein, but the Hadza were consuming large amounts of carbohydrates with the honey, and the Inuit diets include high levels of fat as well. So these diets are healthy and they're working over thousands of years because of how they're balanced. And so we needed to understand that in order to reconstruct the Tsleil-Waututh diet. So it becomes a puzzle. How many different, how much should each of the different food groups contribute? And so I don't expect you to read all these numbers. I just wanted to give you an idea. And I'll try and bring up my laser pointer here. There we go. So we have a table that allows us to play around with different daily servings per person. And then that tells us the percentage of the whole diet. And then we know, based on our nutritional information on the live weight and the live nutritional composition of the different foods, how much protein is offered per 100 grams of the food, which can be converted into a daily serving of protein based on the daily serving in grams of the food itself, and the same with fat. And so this gives us an idea of how all these different pieces can fit together, because we need to be able to have enough food to feed each person, and we have a benchmark, so we needed to meet that benchmark. And we needed to make sure that it was high enough in fat to balance out this really high amount of protein. And I have the results in bigger numbers on the next slide here. But it was basically a giant spreadsheet with a whole bunch of different numbers feeding into each other and trying to puzzle it out and reviewing these drafts over and over again. So after many revisions, after about 1.5 years of data collection and puzzling it out with all of our co-authors, the 1,312 grams of food daily offers an average of 232 grams of protein, 126 grams of fat, and 2,242 calories. So this is over our benchmarks, just over our minimum need. 41% of the calories are coming from protein and 51% of the calories are coming from fat. So again, that's really important. It makes that really, really high contribution of protein safe to consume. And 92% of the dietary protein is coming from marine and tidal sources. This was also important because stable isotope analysis on ancestral remains, human remains, from British Columbia sites indicate that 90 to 100% of diets were coming from marine and intertidal sources. So stable isotope analysis is something that focuses on protein. It also kind of underrepresents plants. So this is something that we're starting to see might be a bit of a too narrow perspective, and plants might be a bigger contributor than we initially thought. But I'll mention more of that in a moment. So based on Tsleil-Waututh oral histories, we know that the 4 pillars of traditional Tsleil-Waututh diets are Pacific herring, Pacific salmon, a few different marine birds, and clams. Our reconstructed diet demonstrates the wide variety of the diet while focusing on the 4 pillars of traditional dietary culture. You can see from this, this graph here, herring and chum salmon are contributing quite a bit. Bivalves and marine and tidal birds are also contributing lots, but we're still seeing fishing, hunting, and harvesting across the ecosystem, which is a really important sustainability approach, making sure that you're not relying too heavily on any one resource. So Mike had some words of reflection on this component, on the dietary reconstruction component specifically. He said, we need to better understand what we ate, how much is enough, how much is too much, what a diet might look like, looking at what resources are there that we ate, where resources are not there anymore that we ate. We need a better understanding of our traditional diet. You have to start somewhere to bring it back. You've got to look at the history, the archaeology. And on harvesting across the ecosystem, he said, there's got to be a balance. And so this perspective on bringing the traditional foodways back and making it safe for the community, health-wise and nutritionally, to eat from the ecosystem again, we have to reconstruct that diet in order to bring it back into the present. And to reconstruct the pre-contact ecosystem baseline of Tsleil-Waututh, we needed to know how much food was taken out of the ecosystem each year by Tsleil-Waututh communities. So this is an example of how that data, how that traditional diet reconstruction was being used. So using those results, we can reconstructed the baseline ecosystem state of Tsleil-Waututh and its watershed from before European contact through an ecosystem modeling process that we continued through this transdisciplinary approach, and we tailored specifically for this research. We used something called EcoPath with EcoSim, which is an ecosystem modeling framework. It's used extensively in fisheries management and scenario assessment, ecological research, and it employs something called a mass balanced approach, which is really important for making sure that everything in the ecosystem is balancing. It includes those predator-prey interactions. It includes understanding how much each thing is eating of each other, and it balances it within the ecosystem to make it realistic. EcoPath is free to download, and the EcoPath Consortium has posted a free course on their YouTube channel and a free textbook through Pressbooks. So it is a really accessible software, and if you're interested in learning more about it, it's possible to do that. And we used a study area of 443 kilometers squared, 103 kilometers squared of which is water and intertidal zone habitats. So we needed this to be able to reconstruct the ecosystem. We need to understand what the ecosystem looked like more specifically. And so we built an EcoPath model set in 1750. It includes 52 of what are called functional groups, which are species or collections of species that create the ecosystem model. And I can go into more details on how you build those kinds of models if folks are interested. To balance the model, we used a best estimate approach using something called analogical reasoning. So this seeks common threads among the data sources. The local ecology determines relationships between the different groups using the diet composition function. And again, this is a really iterative process reviewed by ecosystem modeling experts and our Tsleil-Waututh traditional ecological knowledge experts. But to incorporate the diet work, we wanted to test the maximum human carrying capacity of the ecosystem, meaning how many people could have been sustained on this ecosystem over generations. And so we tested increasing Tsleil-Waututh population sizes using the dietary reconstruction. We use 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, and 20,000, just to get an idea of kind of the possible range. This is represented through something called a fishery fleet in EcoPath. And we used the dietary reconstruction, which was chapter 3 in my dissertation. So this is that piece was just one piece of it, a whole bunch of pieces of how it's all being interacting. But the reconstructed diet gives us an idea. And so here's a section of that really big spreadsheet. As an example, with Pacific herring, if there are 250 grams of Pacific herring per person per day, and you can eat 85% of a live herring, that translates into tons per year per person live, tons per year per however many people you're testing, in this case 10,000. And then you multiply that by the study area size, and then you get your landings. And this is something that we had in the EcoPath model and testing the different population sizes. The maximum population that resulted in a balanced ecosystem state was 10,000 people, which is far higher than previous archaeological estimates. So we aren't saying that the pre-contact population was 10,000. This just means that as modeled, we're estimating that the ecosystem could have sustained up to 10,000 people over generations. Because of who was on the team and because of our research questions, plants are underrepresented in this research. This is an area that I'd really love to focus on to add to these results and the results of the dietary reconstruction specifically, because this would add more potential calories. It would also add to the estimated carrying capacity as well. And this is something that came up kind of as we were finishing up. In my defense, it came up as well because very last minute, right before the defense, another archaeologist emailed me and was like, hey, I have data for you. Unfortunately, it was too late to incorporate in that version of it, but it's something that we would like to look at in the future. So just an overview, just some last thoughts I want to take away. So transdisciplinary archaeology and ecology can serve First Nations and Indigenous community efforts to steward the lands and waters of their territory. So we have this dietary reconstruction, we have this ecosystem reconstruction. Tsleil-Waututh has been using that in order to have conversations with policymakers, in order to obtain food, social, and ceremonial fishery licenses, in order to know what to work toward in terms of what is a healthier ecosystem state. We can never go back to undoing all of the damage from colonization, but we can try and undo some of it. And Tsleil-Waututh has been a pioneer in making those changes happen and in cleaning up the ecosystem and in bringing health back to the inlet. And so this data is helping them in those efforts. This work can sound intimidating. It can sound like a lot of pieces and a lot of data, and it requires teams of experts across disciplinary boundaries and patience and humility to ensure the work is done in a good way, because academic timelines are fast. Academic turnaround is really fast. But when we're working with local communities, we really have to go on their timelines and with their priorities in mind, rather than what the ivory tower would expect from us. So as an example, a 2-week turnaround to review a paper is way too quickly. It's too fast. And so if I wanted those review meetings to go well and be productive for everyone, I had to provide the information to review well in advance, at least a month, if not 6 weeks. And so a lot of the time, my work would be progressing more quickly, but I had to make sure that we were discussing what I offered them and what they had time to read. And so working on community timelines is a really important part of this process, and it requires a lot of patience from the academic side of things. So that's a lot of information. It's a lot of moving pieces, but thank you so much for listening. I also wanted to give you the QR code for the paper for this if you're interested in reading more about it. It was published in the Journal for Ethnobiology. And again, thank you to everyone who made this possible, and to the folks here for inviting me to speak today.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan. That was very, very interesting. I'd like to remind everybody that if you do have any questions for this, our speaker, to go ahead and pop that in the Q&A section. We do have one that came up at the talk through the talk right now. And they were asking, what role, if any, did seaweed play in the diet? I know you said that plants were underrepresented because of all the issues with tissue.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about seaweed very much. We know that eelgrass specifically is important to the diet in that it provides a really important habitat for a lot of the fish and intertidal species. So because it's a more protected ecosystem, those kind of big kind of kelp forests aren't in there, but the eelgrass beds are. And so the eelgrass specifically provided really important habitat. But we haven't really heard from the Tsleil-Waututh knowledge experts on seaweed or those kind of marine and intertidal greenery as food. It's more the forest greenery that's providing food in terms of tubers, berries, nuts, apples, things like that.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because we forget sometimes about the habitat that those the plants and whatnot provide, and it goes along to getting the food that you need, but it's not the food itself that they're using it for. I just had a couple in there that's saying wonderful presentation and on meaningful research for Indigenous peoples, and thank you for the fascinating presentation. We do have another one. It may be way outside your expertise, but can you give us thoughts on the Makah Nation? Oh, this is about the whale hunt. So I don't really know if you have much information on that, but could you determine to what extent cetaceans appeared in the diet of the Tsleil-Waututh, if any?
Yeah, of course. So for Tsleil-Waututh specifically, we don't have a lot of evidence of whale, except for in the context of what looks like opportunistic. So a whale was beached, and then we see some small amounts, of humpback whale bone, but it's really not consistent. And so the current estimation is that it's just opportunistic. A dead whale shows up and it's a lot of food. You're not going to waste that. Killer whales specifically are seen as ancestors, and so you don't eat those. You respect those as ancestors, and so you like that relationship with a lot of these populations are quite different. We do have evidence of some Pacific white-sided dolphin, but again, it seems to be a bit more opportunistic because these are really fast creatures. Dolphins are
They're
fast.
open ocean too, so they're not generally
Exactly, open
in
ocean, yeah.
yeah.
So it depends on what's coming in and how often they would be going out. But when it comes to like traditional cetacean hunting, those numbers are going to be very small in comparison to commercial whaling, which had a massive impact. And so like the tension is similar here around seal hunting. No one wants to see a baby seal die, but seals are an important part of the diet, and they're massively overpopulated. And so the conversation is challenging. But when it comes to traditional diet, as a historical ecologist, it's just like this is what people were eating. If we can do it in a sustainable way, you know, animals are animals. We're animals too. We need to eat. So it's an interesting conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a marine mammalologist, so I'll just make a note that, like, yeah, basically, if a humpback whale is in there, that's going to be a wayward whale. That's generally going to be in that. And so that makes sense that they would not have that as a big part of their diet. And just a reference to the macaw hunt, yeah, like you said, they're looking to hunt. You know, it's like they get 3 or 4 whales a year,
Exactly.
so it's
The
not
numbers
very
are so
high.
small.
Yeah, it's not going to make a difference in the population. Okay, did you find any native oysters in your samples?
Yeah, there are definitely oysters. There are native oysters there. There are also more recently, though the native oysters are also being influenced by the invasive oysters nowadays, coming in with the ships. But there's definitely oyster beds in the inlet and in the diet for sure.
And oysters are so important. They keep everything clean.
So important. They're so good at keeping things clean.
Right? Everybody needs them. Everything.
Yep.
Let's see. How about allergens? In present day, so many people have shellfish and fish allergies. Is there any historical data on that?
Not that I've seen, but it's a really interesting question. It's not something I've ever looked into, but I also think that it depends on like what your ancestors have been eating and have access to. What you're exposed to really young. I think with a lot of food allergies, if you're exposed to it before you're a year old, you're less likely to have food allergies later. I'm very pregnant, and so I'm getting a lot of the recommendations from my doctor. Expose them to peanuts before they're a
Right,
year.
do it now. Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
exactly. So I think it helps when the pregnant person's eating it, and if they're exposed to it early on, there's less of a likelihood of food allergy. So it's just interesting. Yeah, but it would be really cool to look at that in the record.
Yeah, that would be. And congratulations, by the way. This is very exciting.
Thank you.
So this question is, they were asking about, can you claim an Indigenous-led research project when Indigenous people are not the ones speaking about the research?
Yeah, that is a good question. So they have all the data, we created posters together to share. And so as a member of the research team, I can speak about my role as a member of the research team and what I did and what we did as a team. All of the work falls under Tsleil-Waututh data sovereignty. And they are like their representatives and our Tsleil-Waututh co-authors are speaking about this in their own venues and when they are invited to do it. So whenever we have, if you've seen it in the news, you'll see specifically Michelle George speaking about it, because when they speak to me, they want to speak to her first and then to me as kind of ancillary. So Michelle is the one who's speaking to the news here. But it really depends on who's reached out to. And currently they are asking me to help represent the work because Michelle is so overburdened with requests. And that is something that's really common when we're working with these Indigenous knowledge holders. They are super overburdened. And so when the nation is okay with me taking these things on, I do. And whenever I go to a conference to speak about the work, they review what I'm saying and making sure that it's representative of how they want it represented. So it is definitely something where a white person is speaking on the work, but it's with the nation's permission. which is in the case of a white person speaking on the work, it's the best case scenario. But yeah, it's a good point, and it's something that you should always check on. Yeah.
Yeah, well, on this part, I think you're very right that many people are overburdened, and it's particularly, tribes and First Nations. They're, they don't have a lot of people being able to do that. So it's helpful when you can do this kind of work and they can still have that kind of oversight over it and have it be their work that you can just help share.
Absolutely.
Where did you find or access the archival records, such as ships records and newspapers? Did you have fun at libraries?
Oh yes. Oh yes, definitely. So a lot of those ships records are published as journals, which is really interesting.
Oh.
And those can be found, I found them at our institutional library, University of British Columbia Library. And then also City of Vancouver has an archives department, and it's free to access. You can look at those records online now, which is really cool. It's all digitized. And so there are maps, newspaper articles, pictures, things like that, which is really exciting. So the local, like smaller government record archives are a really great place to look. And then early anthropology did also read and cite those journals. So I was able to find those. There was one in Spanish, which I thankfully read a little bit of, enough to be able to translate it. And those were published as well. A lot of the times those folks would go back home and then publish those journals as a book, which is really helpful for us later. Yeah.
I never realized that the fish, like the journals for the ships and stuff, would just be put in a little tome, and then there you go. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Have similar dietary studies been carried out for neighboring or nearby groups? Upland resources seem to be documented in greater importance by other ethnoecologists, but perhaps not as in the archaeological. She says they believe Robert Boyd has analyzed some dietary information related to disease and malnutrition research, ?
Yes, yeah. So other folks have done dietary assessments and stuff like that, dietary studies. Nothing with this specific approach, which is something we created for this project. But there are lots of records of Coast Salish diets, kind of looking at the big picture of Coast Salish diets, and then focusing in on a few different communities. Those are kind of the early anthropology approaches as well. They also detail things like fishing methods, the different types of fish hooks for different types of fish, things like that. And so those are also very helpful. That was something we included under historical records as well as the archaeological records if they used archaeological data. So they definitely exist. Robert Boyd also did work on like population dynamics and things like that. And so we did draw on his work as well in the literature for sure. Yeah.
Right. And someone just wants to help with the pronunciation.
Of course.
I think it's slow. I mean, I can only say Tsleil-Waututh, but without the tooth, like just the Tsleil. Is that right?
Yeah. Sorry, I say it quickly now after all these years, and it's not very helpful to folks. It's Tsleil-Waututh or Tsleil-Wat. It's like saying sleigh, and then you just add the ul at the end, so Tsleil-Wat or Tsleil-Waututh. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's this kind of times can be tricky. You want to be able to know you're saying it correctly. Was there any knowledge shared with you about how all these foods were prepared?
Yeah, so something that's interesting about chum salmon specifically is that it's slightly lower in fat, and so it smokes really well. So yeah, so when we're talking about food preservation, smoking is a big one. Within Coast Salish communities in general, preservation in fat is really helpful too. So ulakan is also known as candlefish because it's really fatty.
Oh, the candlefish, yeah.
Yeah, and so you can render that fat and you can use it to preserve things, and so that's common as well. We didn't really look into seasonality because we didn't have time, but a lot of these foods span the year around in different sections. So we have forage fish coming in at a different time than salmon, coming in at a different time as the ducks and stuff like that. And so that helped with preservation. You don't need to preserve as much if food is available year round. Also helps that this is a rainforest environment that's relative compared to other places, relatively warm year round.
Yeah.
So that also
That's why,
helps.
that's why I like living here. It doesn't really get below 40 very often. It's great.
Exactly. Yeah, there is a really excellent book that focused on this in Newchalnoth territories on the west coast of Vancouver Island called Teachings of the Tides. If you're interested in kind of the general area, not Coast Salish, but is neighboring. Teachings of the Tides is a really incredible book that is co-authored by a Hauset elder, and it goes into really in depth onto harvesting and preservation and consumption and all these things. It's fascinating, and I haven't found anything like it for the Coast Salish communities, unfortunately. But one day, hopefully, that'll come out.
Come out, yeah.
Yeah.
Does one, I know that we just have a few minutes left, I think. How does removal of dams fit into your research? If at all?
Oh, I bet this is because of the removal of dam that just happened, which is so exciting.
Oh, I just saw that on social media and stuff. It's very awesome.
Yeah, it's so exciting to see that work happen. We don't have a dam here that is in this specific ecosystem in the inlet here in Tsleil-Waututh, Burrard Inlet, but it is a kind of a big topic in British Columbia. Dams, hydroelectric work, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, all of this infrastructure is impacting salmon habitats. Forestry also impacts salmon habitats. So it is really important in that it helps us understand kind of like how those ecosystems have been degraded by those urban developments and those industrial developments, which in some cases limit the salmon population, or in some case make the salmon population completely go away. So it is important kind of in the bigger context, just not in the specific inlet.
Well, and again, that the Salish Sea is one giant connected ecosystem. So things you do in other places are going to affect the animals that are swimming all around. So
Exactly.
very important.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have one last question. If you see two fish vertebrae, is that two fish or two species of one fish?
There are different ways of counting. In this case, two fish vertebrae would probably be a minimum number of individuals of one, but it would be a number of identified specimens of two. So what we do in archaeology is usually nowadays we use either minimum number of individuals or number of identified specimens. So those are the two kind of big ways to count them. But we don't try and go to very, very specific numbers of exactly a certain number of salmon or exactly a certain number of elk or whatever it is, because when we're talking about a midden or a shell deposit, these are massive. They're the size of an apartment building sometimes. And so we take out such a tiny piece of it, 5%, less than 5% of the overall assemblage. And so we can't really make those counts accurately. So we do proportions instead.
Yeah, so you can do relations within the pot to see
Exactly.
how much there is versus absolute numbers. Yeah, absolute numbers are hard in nature in general.
Very, yeah, for sure. Totally, very hard. Yeah.
All right, well, I want to thank you, Dr. Efford, for your wonderful presentation today. And from all of us at Western Washington University and the Salish Sea Institute, we want to thank you for joining us today, everybody. Thank you so much. We also want to thank the WWU Alumni Office for their partnership. They make these webinars happen. And we'd like to thank those of you who chose to support the Salish Sea Institute as part of this webinar as well and help us produce more of these wonderful events. The recording to the webinar will be emailed out in the next few days, so keep an eye out. Check soon in your email. It should be arriving just in a few days. So you can go back and you can share it with others too. It will be up on the website. So with that, thank you again, Dr. Efford, and everybody.
Thank you.